Classified equipment from my unit appeared on the black market on a Friday morning in March. Not a rumor, not a report from a source that needed verification, a confirmed identification. Serial numbers matched to our unit's inventory, photographed in a transaction that federal investigators had been monitoring for 6 weeks before they traced the origin and made the call that landed on my commanding general's desk at 0700. My commanding general called me at 0730. He said, "Captain Hartley, I need you in my office at 0800. Come alone." I said, "Yes, sir." I was there at 0755. I need to tell you about the equipment before I tell you about the investigation, because the nature of what was taken matters for understanding the weight of what followed. I will not describe the equipment in specific terms because classification requirements do not bend for personal accounts. What I will tell you is that it was not peripheral, not the kind of equipment whose absence would go unnoticed for months and whose value was primarily financial. It was equipment whose operational significance was significant, equipment whose presence in the wrong hands created a problem that went beyond the loss of an asset. The general told me this in his office at 0800. He told me in the specific, efficient language of a senior officer who has already processed the situation and who is now communicating it to the person he has decided to put in charge of addressing it. He said, "I'm assigning you to lead the internal investigation. You have full access to unit records, personnel files, and the federal investigation's preliminary findings. You report directly to me. Nobody else in the unit knows the investigation is being run internally. As far as your team is concerned, you're conducting a routine inventory audit." I said, "Who knows about the identification?" He said, "You, me, and the federal agents who made the call. That's it." I said, "Why me, sir?" He looked at me. He said, "Because your record is clean, your access is appropriate, and because I trust your judgment. And because the preliminary profile suggests the source is someone with a specific level of access that narrows the field considerably." He slid a folder across the desk. He said, "The preliminary profile." I opened it. I read it once. Then I closed it and I looked at the wall behind the general's head for a moment. The profile described someone with 8 to 12 years of service, specific technical clearance, access to the storage protocols for this category of equipment, and, the detail that sat heaviest, a long-term working relationship with at least one other person in the unit who could provide cover. The profile described, in its broad outlines, approximately 4 people in our unit. One of them was my partner of 8 years. I need to tell you about Maya. Maya and I had been partnered for 8 years, a partnership that in military intelligence work means something more specific and more loaded than the word suggests in civilian contexts. It means the person who has your back in operational settings, the person who knows your methodology and your blind spots and your tells under pressure, the person whose judgment you have tested in conditions that test judgment and found reliable. We had been through 3 deployments together. We had been in rooms where the information was difficult and the decisions were consequential, and the margin for error was not something either of us allowed ourselves to think about. We had built, over 8 years, the specific trust of people who have been reliable for each other in conditions where reliability is not a given. She was the person I called when things went wrong. She was the person who had sat beside me in the hospital waiting room when my daughter was born. She was the person whose number I had given my children's school as an emergency contact. And the preliminary profile described her. Not her specifically, the profile was not that precise, but the parameters it described placed her in the field of 4. And when I looked at those 4 names and I looked at the specific technical access the profile required and the specific cover capacity it implied, the field of 4 became, in my understanding of the unit and its dynamics, a field of 1. I drove home that evening and I sat in my kitchen and I looked at my phone. I did not call her. The investigation took 6 weeks. I will not walk you through every step because some of it is still classified, and some of it belongs to a process that is not mine to describe publicly. What I will tell you is the shape of it. the way an internal investigation of this kind works when the person running it is trying to build a case that is irrefutable rather than sufficient. Sufficient is not enough when the person you are investigating is someone you have trusted for 8 years. Sufficient leaves room for her attorney to construct an alternative. Irrefutable does not. I spent 6 weeks building Irrefutable. I reviewed every access log, every inventory record, every movement record that fell within the relevant time frame. I reviewed communications in the ways that investigations of this kind have authority to review communications. I followed the financial trail that the federal investigators had already begun and that I now had access to extend. Every trail led to the same place. I want to be clear about my experience of this, because I think honesty requires it. There were mornings in those 6 weeks when I hoped I was wrong, when I looked at a piece of evidence and turned it over and looked for the alternative interpretation, the explanation that would redirect the trail somewhere else, toward someone else, toward a version of events in which Maya was not where every trail was pointing. I am a rigorous analyst. I have been trained to follow evidence rather than preference. The evidence did not offer me an alternative interpretation. Every trail led to Maya. At the end of the 5th week, I had what I needed. At the end of the 6th week, I had something beyond what I needed. I had Irrefutable. I briefed the general on a Monday morning. He reviewed everything. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Is there anything in here that could be read another way?" I said, "No, sir." He said, "You're certain?" I said, "Yes, sir." He was quiet for another moment. He said, "I know what this costs you." I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "File the formal report. I'll contact the federal investigators." I said, "Sir, I'd like to speak to her first, before the formal process moves." He looked at me. I said, "I've been her partner for 8 years. I need to give her the opportunity to hear it from me before she hears it from the process." He considered that. He said, "You have until 1700. I called Maya at 1400 and asked her to meet me at the coffee shop near the base that we had used for years for the conversations that needed to happen off base. She said, "Everything okay?" I said, "I need to talk to you in person." She said, "I'll be there at 14:30. She was there when I arrived. She was sitting at our usual table with 2 coffees already ordered, mine the way she had known I took it for 8 years, and she looked at me when I came in with the specific, practiced attention of someone who knows how to read a person and who was reading me now. She knew something was wrong. I could see it in the quality of her attention, the slightly elevated alertness, the way she was watching my hands as well as my face. 8 years of partnership teaches you to read each other. I was reading her, reading me. I sat down. I said, "I've been running an investigation for the past 6 weeks. She was still. I said, "Classified equipment from our unit, black market identification. You know what I'm going to tell you." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "How long have you known?" Not, "What are you talking about?" Not, "That's impossible." Not any of the responses that innocence produces. "How long have you known?" I said, "The preliminary profile pointed to you in the 1st week. It took me 5 more weeks to build the complete case." She said, "Why are you here? Why not the MPs?" I said, "Because you're my partner, and I needed to tell you myself." She looked at her coffee. She said, "I needed the money." 4 words. I needed the money. 8 years. 3 deployments, the hospital waiting room, my children's school emergency contact. I needed the money. I said, "I know." I said, "The formal process moves at 1700. You should speak to an attorney before then." She looked at me. She said, "I'm sorry, Claire." I said, "I know." I stood up. I left the coffee on the table. The formal process moved at 1700 as I had told her it would. The federal investigators were notified. The military process was initiated. I will not describe what followed in detail because it is ongoing and because the people involved deserve whatever privacy a federal proceeding can offer. What I will tell you is what I know. The equipment has been recovered. Not all of it. Some of it is gone in the way that things are gone when they have moved through enough hands in enough transactions. But a significant portion of it has been recovered, which matters in ways that go beyond the unit and that I will not describe further. Maya is in the process. I will not say more than that. And I am still serving. I want to tell you that because I think it matters, that the investigation and its outcome and the weight of what it cost personally did not end my career or my service or my commitment to the work. If anything, it clarified something that I think needed clarifying, that the work is more important than any single relationship within it, however significant that relationship has been. That trust is not infinite, that the people and the institutions you serve are not the same thing as the individuals you trust inside those institutions. The individuals can fail, the institution continues. I continue with it. I want to say something about the coffee she ordered. Mine the way she had known I took it for 8 years. I have thought about that detail many times since the Monday afternoon at 14:30. The specific, ordinary intimacy of it, that she ordered my coffee correctly out of habit, out of 8 years of sitting across from me at that table, out of the knowledge of me that partnership builds and that does not disappear overnight even when everything else does. She had already made the decision that led to the investigation. She had been living with that decision for months, and she sat down at our table and she ordered my coffee the way she always ordered it, and she waited for me. I do not know what to do with that detail. I have not found a way to resolve it into something clean. It sits in me the way that certain true things sit, not as a wound, not as evidence of something larger, just as a true thing that does not simplify. She ordered my coffee, and then she looked at me when I came in with the readiness of someone who already knew. People ask me, when I tell parts of this story, how I ran the investigation without letting what I was finding affect my objectivity, how I followed every trail to where it led without the relationship distorting the evidence. The honest answer is that I did not always manage it perfectly. There were moments in those 6 weeks when I stopped before I looked at something and I made myself look anyway, when I found an alternative interpretation and I tested it honestly before I concluded it didn't hold, when I sat at my desk at 0200 with the evidence in front of me and I allowed myself to feel what it was, and then I filed it and went back to the work. The work is the answer. The rigor of the work, the specific, demanding requirement to follow evidence rather than preference is what held. Not because I am someone who feels nothing, but because I am someone who has been trained to not let feeling be the only thing. To hold the feeling and the work simultaneously without letting either one erase the other.
That is what 12 years of service taught me. It turned out I needed it for something I had not anticipated. Trust is built in conditions that test it, and sometimes, not always, but sometimes, the conditions that test it most severely are the ones that reveal that the trust was misplaced. That revelation is painful, and it does not diminish the 12 years that came before it. She doesn't stay silent. She doesn't stay broken. She rises. Sometimes rising is 6 weeks of building an irrefutable case against the person you trusted most. Sometimes rising is ordering the coffee anyway and sitting down and saying, "You know what I'm going to tell you." And sometimes rising is standing up afterward, leaving the coffee on the table, and going back to the work. Subscribe. New story every week, and every single one of them ends the same way. She rises. Leave a comment. Have you ever had to choose between loyalty to a person and loyalty to something larger? I read every single one.